There were 19 of us working the lower gallery that spring. By the end of June, 11 were on the ground. 2 had stopped speaking entirely, and the rest of us had agreed, without ever saying so out loud, that we would never again describe what we had seen to anyone who had not been there. I have broken that agreement twice. Once in the autumn of 1903, to a Jesuit at the seminary in Verdun, a thin grey man named Father Aubrac, who heard me out for nearly 4 hours, and at the end of it asked me only one question, which I will get to later, and once in 1924, to a clerk from the prefecture at Bar-le-Duc, who came to my house with a folder under his arm and a deposition form already filled out in another man's handwriting, asking me to sign it. I read what was written, and I signed it, and I left out everything that mattered. I am 91 years old now. My wife has been in the ground since the winter before last. My son lives in Reims, and visits me at Easter and at All Saints, and he's a good boy. But he does not know any of this, and I'm not going to tell him. I'm going to tell it here instead, because there is no one left who can be hurt by it, and because I have been carrying it for 68 years, and a man should set down what he carries before he goes. My name is Henri Lacombe. I was born in 1873 in a village in the Meuse hills called Saint-Maurin, which you will not find on any modern map, because the village was struck off the rolls in 1934 after the last of its families moved down to Commercy. My father was a stonecutter, and his father had been a stonecutter, and there was never any question about what I would do for my living. I was apprenticed to the foreman of the quarry above the village when I was 14 years old. By the spring I'm going to tell you about, I was 23, and I had been on the lower benches for 9 years, and I knew limestone the way a man knows the back of his own hand. I want to say something about the country before I go further, because the country matters, and because the men who have written about that part of France since the war have mostly written about the trenches and the cemeteries, and not about what the land was before. The Meuse hills in the 1890s were a hard, beautiful working country. The valleys were narrow and green. The hills above them were pale with limestone wherever the trees had been cut back, and the limestone here was famous. The Uville stone, they called it, the same stone that built the Place Stanislas at Nancy and the great sweep of the Paris Opera. There were quarries at Uville and at Léroville and at Sorcy, and a smaller one above our village at Saint-Maurin, which had been cut into the hillside in the time of Napoleon I, and worked steadily ever since. The work was hard, but it was good work. We were paid in coin, not in scrip. We had 2 churches, a school, a doctor who came up from Commercy on Wednesdays, and a widow named Madame Corvisart, who ran a kitchen for the unmarried men, where you could eat for 6 sous and drink rough red wine for 2 more. The stone was fossiliferous and pale and warm-coloured, and when you split a fresh block open on a clear morning in spring, the inside of it smelled faintly of the sea, which it had been 200 million years before any of us were born. The foreman at Saint-Maurin in 1896 was a man called Jean Picard. He was 46 years old that spring, a square, slow, careful man with grey in his moustache and hands like split oak. He had been a quarryman since he was 12. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand in 1881 to a hang fire, which is the term for a black powder charge that does not detonate when it should, and detonates instead some seconds later, when the man checking on it has put his face above the borehole. He had never raised his voice in my hearing. He had never made a careless decision. I tell you this because what happened at Saint-Maurin was not the fault of the foreman, and I want that to be on the record before anything else. The crew that spring numbered 19, which included the foreman and his apprentice, who was me. I will name them now, the way you name the dead at a funeral, because most of them never had a proper one. There were the two Belgian brothers, Lucien and Théophile Vossen, from a town near Liège, who had come to the Meuse in 1893 looking for work, and had stayed because the wages were better than at home, and because Lucien had married a girl from Saucy. There was the powder man, a thin, sour, intelligent man named Bertrand Cailloz, who had served his time at the great works at L'Hérouville, and had come up to Saint-Maurin because the air was cleaner and his lungs were no longer good. There was old Mathieu Reynard, who was 61 and should have been pensioned off 2 years before, but who had nowhere to be pensioned off to, and who still worked a hammer faster than men half his age. There were 6 younger men in their 20s, mostly local, mostly with families. There were 3 older boys, 15 and 16, who fetched water and cleaned tools and were not allowed near the powder. There was the priest's nephew, a boy of 19 named Pascal Tardieu, sent up from Toul by an uncle who hoped that hard work would knock the dreaminess out of him. And there was a man called Ferret, whose first name no one ever used, who had appeared in the village the previous October looking for winter work, and who had stayed on into the spring because Picard had found him capable. He kept to himself. He drank alone. He went to Mass. He was perhaps 50 years old, with a face that had been to places the rest of us had not. I am going to be honest. I did not pay close attention to Ferret in those early weeks. None of us did. He was a quiet man among quiet men. It was only later that I went back through my memory of that spring and found him standing in nearly every image I could recover, slightly apart from the rest of us, watching. The contract that brought all of this down on our heads came to Picard in the 2nd week of April, 1896. It came from a man named Théodore Guillory, who was the regional agent for a building consortium in Nancy that had taken on a large public commission, a new Hôtel des Postes, if I remember correctly, and some related works, and who needed a great deal of high-quality limestone delivered before the end of summer. The L'Hérouville quarries were already overcommitted. The Youville quarries were already overcommitted. Guillory came up to Saint-Maurin in a hired carriage on a Tuesday afternoon, ate at Madame Corvisar's, and offered Picard a contract that would have doubled the quarry's takings for the year. There was a condition. The stone had to come from the lower benches, the deeper galleries that had not been actively worked for nearly a generation. The upper faces had been cut back as far as the geology allowed without endangering the village above. To deliver the tonnage Guillory wanted, in the time he wanted, we would have to go down. I was not in the room when Picard and Guillory spoke, but I was outside the door, and what I heard was Picard saying 3 separate times that he did not want to take the contract. He gave reasons. The lower galleries had been sealed in 1873 by his predecessor for cause. The drainage was uncertain. The ventilation would have to be recut. The men would need additional pay for the deeper work, which would eat into the margin. He was, as I have said, a careful man. Quarry raised the price. Picard said no. Quarry raised the price again and added that if Saint-Maurin would not take the contract, it would go to a Belgian firm at Dinant, and that firm would in time absorb other contracts as well, and Saint-Maurin would not see Nancy work again in Picard's lifetime. He said this not as a threat, but as a fact, in the calm, pleasant tone of a man who has done this kind of negotiation many times before. Picard was silent for a long while. Then he took the contract. I want to be careful here, because I have spent a great deal of my life thinking about whether Picard was at fault for that decision, and I have decided that he was not. He had 19 families depending on the quarry. He had a village that would empty out within a decade if the stonework went elsewhere. He did what a foreman does. He weighed the risk he could see against the harm he could see, and he chose. The risk he could not see was not his fault. None of us could see it. It had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and it had learned to be patient. We began reopening the lower gallery on the 23rd of April. The work was slow at first, and ordinary. The 1873 seal was a brick wall 5 courses thick, set into a frame of squared limestone, with a date and the initials of the previous foreman cut into the keystone. Caillot, the powder man, looked at it for a long time before we touched it. He asked Picard whether anyone living remembered why the gallery had been closed. Picard said that the official reason in the quarry log was poor ventilation and unstable roof. Caillot asked whether there was an unofficial reason. Picard said that if there was, it had not been written down, and the men who would have known were dead. We took the wall down course by course over 2 days. Behind it, the gallery was dry, which surprised us, and the air that came out of it smelled of nothing in particular. Picard sent 2 of the younger men in with lamps to check the roof. They came back and reported that the gallery ran straight for about 40 meters, then turned, and that the working face at the end of the straight section showed clean limestone with good color, exactly the kind of stone Quarry had ordered. The first week of May was the best work of my life. I want you to understand that because of what came after. The stone was beautiful, the benches cut clean. The blocks came out square and heavy and warm to the touch, and the light from our kerosene lamps made the fossil patterns inside them shine like something underwater. We were paid extra for the depth, and we ate well at Madame Corvisar's at night, and the village above us was full of the smell of bread and the sound of children, and it was spring, and we were proud. On the morning of the 11th of May, old Mathieu Reynard came up from the lower gallery and said, in a quiet conversational voice, that the rats were gone. He said it to Picard in the small wooden hut where Picard kept his maps and his ledgers, and I happened to be in the hut at the time, sharpening a chisel at the bench by the window. I heard it because I was meant to hear it, I think. Mathieu had been a quarryman for 49 years, and he was not a man who said things for the pleasure of saying them. Picard looked up from his ledger. He said, "Since when?" Mathieu said, 3 days, maybe 4. I noticed it this morning." Picard set down his pen. He said, "Are you sure?" Mathieu said, "I have been working stone since I was 12 years old. I am sure." Picard sat for a moment with his hands flat on the ledger. Then he said, "Don't tell the men." Mathieu nodded and went back down. I sharpened the chisel until the edge was ready, and then I stayed at the bench longer than I needed to, because I did not want Picard to know that I had heard. I was 23 years old. I knew what it meant when the rats left work. Every quarryman knew. The rats followed the lamps and the food and the warmth of working bodies, and they did not leave a gallery while men were still going down into it. Not unless something else had come into the gallery that they did not want to share it with. I went down into the lower gallery that afternoon with the rest of the crew, and I worked my shift, and I said nothing. That night I did not sleep well. I lay in my bed in the room I shared with two of the younger men above Madame Corvisar's kitchen, and I listened to the wind moving in the chestnut trees outside the window, and I thought about the rats, and I thought about the wall we had taken down, and I thought about the gallery turning to the left at 40 meters, and what might be on the other side of that turn that we had not yet cut into. I did not yet know that the gallery did not end where the working face was. I did not yet know that what we had been cutting toward, all that beautiful first week of May, was not virgin stone. I did not yet know that there was a second wall, deeper in, set into the limestone by hands that were not the hands of the men of 1873, or the hands of any quarrymen we had records of, or the hands of any people we would have recognized as our own. I would learn all of that, in the order a man learns such things, over the next 4 days. I want to describe the lower gallery to you properly, because everything that came after depended on the shape of it. And if you do not see the place clearly in your mind, you will not understand why we did the things we did. You went down by a sloped tunnel cut into the side of the hill. The mouth of it was framed in dressed stone and timbered with oak, and the slope inside ran for perhaps 60 paces before it levelled out into the working gallery proper. The walls were pale Uville limestone, the same pale, warm stone we sold by the ton to Nancy and to Paris, and on a clear morning when the lamps were lit, you could see the fossils inside the walls, the round buttons of crinoid stems, the shells of small sea creatures from a sea that had dried up before any human being existed, and the whole gallery had a quiet underwater feeling about it, even though it was dry. The working face, when we reopened the lower gallery on the 23rd of April, was at a depth of about 32 meters below the surface. That is not deep by the standards of a coal mine, but for a stone quarry, it is deep enough that you do not see daylight from any point inside the gallery, and the only sound that reaches you from the surface is the muffled thump of the cart wheels turning above when the stone is being hauled up. We worked with a kerosene lamp. Each man carried his own, hung from a hook on the wall behind him while he was cutting, and the light those lamps gave off was a yellow, flickering thing, generous enough at close range and almost useless at 20 paces. When you stepped away from your lamp to fetch a tool or to speak to another man, your shadow stretched and then dissolved, and the part of the gallery you had stepped into became a darkness that moved with you. I tell you this because the darkness in the lower gallery was not the darkness of a room at night. It was older, and it was thicker, and a man working in it for 10 hours at a stretch came up at the end of his shift feeling that he had been somewhere the body remembered, without being able to name. On the morning of the 12th of May, the day after Mathieu Reynard told the foreman that the rats were gone, we cut into the second wall. It was Lucien Vossen, the older of the two Belgian brothers, who struck it first. He was working the center of the face with a heavy chisel and a 4-pound hammer, and he had been advancing well all morning when his chisel rang differently. Stone on stone gives a particular sound. Stone on dressed stone, on a face that has been cut by another hand, gives a different sound. Lucien stopped. He stepped back. He held up a hand to the man behind him to stop hammering. The gallery went quiet, which in our work meant only the sound of breathing and the small hiss of the lamps. Lucien said, "There is a wall in the rock." Picard came down from the upper gallery within 10 minutes. I went down behind him because I was his apprentice, and that was where I was supposed to be. And I want to tell you what we found, because I have remembered it every day of my life since. The face Lucien had been cutting showed at first only what looked like an irregular seam in the limestone, a pale line, perhaps a finger's breadth across, running roughly vertical for about a meter, and then disappearing into the surrounding stone. To a man who did not know quarry work, it would have looked like nothing. To Lucien, who had been cutting stone since he was a boy in the Ardennes, it had been enough to stop his hammer. Picard took the chisel from him and worked along the seam himself for perhaps a quarter of an hour. He moved carefully, taking small bites, dressing back the face rather than driving forward into it. The seam widened. The pale line became a pale band, and the band became an edge, and behind the edge, set into the limestone of the hillside, was masonry. It was a wall. I want to be careful describing it, because the description matters. The wall was built of cut stone blocks, each block roughly the size of a man's head, mortared together with a grey mortar that had hardened into something almost as durable as the stone itself. The blocks were not Ouville limestone. They were a darker, denser stone, the kind that men in our region called pierre bleue, blue stone, which is not blue at all, but a dark, cool grey, and which came from the Belgian quarries on the Meuse, 200 kilometres to the north of us, and which had been used by the Romans for foundation work and aqueducts in this part of Gaul before there was a France at all. The stone blocks had been cut with a method I recognized, because every quarryman recognizes it. Along the edges of the blocks, you could see the shallow rectangular sockets where iron wedges had been driven in lines to split the stone from its parent rock. It was the Roman method. It had been the Roman method for 1,000 years before the Romans, and it had been used in our region by Roman quarrymen in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ. The wall was, on its face, perhaps 1,800 years old. Picard stood looking at it for a long time. He had taken his cap off without seeming to notice he had done so, and was holding it in his hand. He said, almost to himself, "There is no Roman work on this hill." Caillot, the powder man, who had come down behind us, said, "There is now." Picard sent the men back to the upper gallery. He kept Caillot and me with him. The three of us stood in front of the wall in the yellow lamplight, and I will tell you exactly what we saw, because Picard asked me later to write it down for the Quarry log, and I wrote it down then, while it was fresh, and I have remembered it since. The exposed face of the wall, as we had cleared it, was about 1.5 meters wide and 1.5 meters tall. We could see 11 full blocks and parts of 4 others. The mortar between the blocks was uniform and well laid. The blocks themselves had been dressed on the visible side, which is to say they had been smoothed and squared by hand after they were cut, which is what you do to a wall that is meant to be seen. This was the part that did not make sense. A foundation wall, a wall that is going to be buried in earth or stone, you do not bother to dress. You set the rough block. You mortar it. You move on. The Romans were practical men in their work. They did not waste mason hours dressing the face of a wall that no one was going to look at. This wall had been dressed on the side facing us, which meant that the side facing us, the side now exposed by Lucien's chisel, the side that had been buried under 32 meters of solid Yeovil limestone for what could only have been a very long geological time, had once been the inside face of a room. I said this to Picard, slowly, working it out as I spoke. He said, "Yes, I have understood that." Kylo said, "Then we are not looking at a wall. We are looking at the inside of a chamber." We stood there in silence for a while. Picard said, "Bring the lamps closer." We brought the lamps closer, and we held them up to the wall, and we examined the dressed face block by block. The mason work was good. It was very good. The joints were tight. The dressing was even. It was the work of a man, or of men, who had known what they were doing and had taken their time. In the upper left corner of the exposed face, on the second block down from the top, there was a mark. It had been cut into the stone with a chisel before the wall was set in place. It was perhaps the size of a child's open hand. It was a single mark, deeply incised, and it was not Latin. I had been to school. I had read what Latin a country boy in the Meuse could be expected to read. The mark was not a letter. It was not a number. It was not, so far as I could tell, any sign I had seen on a Roman tomb, or a Roman milestone, or a Roman boundary stone in our region. It was a shape. I am not going to describe the shape here, because the priest at Verdun, when I described it to him in 1903, asked me not to draw it for any other person while he was alive. And although he is now long dead, I have kept that promise out of a feeling I cannot quite explain. I will say only that it was a closed figure, and that it suggested an eye that was not an eye, and that looking at it for too long made the back of my neck cold in a way that the temperature of the gallery did not account for. Picard looked at the mark for a long time. Then he said, "Cover it back up." Kylo said, "Cover it up." Picard said, "Mortar over it. Leave it. We work the next bench. We tell Giori the seam ran out. We will finish the contract somewhere else." Kylo said, "We cannot finish the contract somewhere else. There is no other face that gives us the tonnage." Picard said nothing. Kylo said, "Jean, there is no other face." Picard put his cap back on. He stood with his hand against the dressed Roman stone for a moment, and then he said, "We will think about it tonight. Tomorrow we decide." We went back up to the surface in silence. Picard went into his hut and closed the door. Kylo went to the powder magazine, which was a small stone shed at the edge of the upper yard, and went in there and closed the door also. And I do not know what he did inside it, but he was there for nearly an hour. I went up to the village, and I ate at Madame Corvisar's, and I drank more than I usually drank, and I went to my room above the kitchen, and I lay on my bed in my work clothes, and I tried to sleep. I could not sleep. At about 11 o'clock that night, I heard somebody knocking on the door of the kitchen below. I heard Madame Corvisart go down and unlatch it. I heard a man's voice, very low, and Madame Corvisart's voice answering. And then the door closed again, and her footsteps went back up the stairs to her own room. 20 minutes later, there was another knock. This time I went to the window of my room, and I looked down into the lane, and I saw, standing at Madame Corvisart's door, the man Ferret. He was not knocking now. He was standing back from the door with his hands at his sides, looking up at the window of my room. He was not a man who would have known which window was mine. There was no reason for him to be looking at it. He was looking at it anyway. When he saw my face at the glass, he did not move, and he did not speak. He looked at me for what was probably only a few seconds, but felt longer, and then he turned and walked away up the lane toward the upper village, and the moonlight was on his back as he walked, and he did not look round. I went back to my bed, and I lay on my back in the dark with my eyes open, and I waited for morning. It came eventually, the way mornings do, but before it came, at perhaps 3 o'clock, when the village above was as still as it ever got, and the only sound in the world was the wind moving in the chestnut trees, I heard, very faintly, from the direction of the quarry, a sound that I told myself at the time was a fox. It was not the cry of a fox. It was the sound of something striking a stone. 3 times, slowly, with pauses between the strikes long enough for the sound to die away completely before the next one began. Then it stopped. In the morning, when we went down into the lower gallery to begin our shift, the wall Lucien had uncovered was no longer covered. Somebody had been down in the night and had cleared away the stone Picard had ordered, packed back over the Roman face, and had dressed the working bench clean, and had set the lamps in position, ready for the day's work. The lamps were still lit. They had been burning since at least 4 in the morning, by Caillots's reckoning of the oil they had consumed, which meant somebody had been alone in the lower gallery for at least 3 hours before any of us went down. And on the floor, in front of the dressed Roman face, set neatly in the limestone dust, were 3 small stone chips. They had not come from the wall. They had come from the inside. I want to say something about Picard before I describe the morning of the 13th of May, because I have been thinking lately about the burden that man carried, and I would like the record to be fair to him. He had been foreman at Saint-Maurin for 19 years by that spring. In that time, 3 men had died in the workings. 1 in a rockfall in 1879, 2 in the hang fire of 1881 that took his fingers, and he carried each of those deaths as if he had been the cause of them, although he had not been. He went to Mass every Sunday, and to confession every Friday evening. He kept his ledgers in a hand so small and careful that you needed to hold the page near the lamp to read it. He had a wife, Marie, and 4 daughters, the youngest of whom was 11 that spring, and who used to bring his lunch down to the quarry yard in a covered basket. I tell you this so that when I describe what he did on the morning of the 13th of May, you understand that the man making the decision was not a reckless man, and was not a stupid man. and was not a man easily moved by money or by the threats of men like Guillory. He was a man at the end of his courage. That is a different thing. We were standing in front of the Roman wall again, the four of us, Picard, Caillot, Lucien Vossen, and me, at perhaps 6:30 in the morning, with the lit lamps that had been left in the night still burning on their hooks, and the 3 small stone chips lying on the limestone dust at our feet. None of us had touched the chips. I do not know why. There was a feeling about them that none of us wanted to be the one to disturb. Caillot was the first to speak. He said, "Somebody came down here in the night." Picard said, "Somebody came down here in the night, and that somebody had a key to the powder magazine, because the lamps that were lit are the lamps from the magazine rack, and the magazine was locked when we came up yesterday, and it was locked when I checked it this morning." Caillot said, "Then it is one of us." Picard said, "Yes." Lucien Vossen, who had been quiet, said in his careful French, he spoke French well, but with the long Walloon vowels of the Liège country, "The chips on the floor, they are not Ouville stone." We looked. He was right. The 3 chips on the floor were the dark, dense grey of pierre bleue, the Belgian stone of the wall, which meant they had been struck off the wall. But the wall in front of us, when we lifted our lamps to it, showed no fresh chiselling. The dressed Roman face was as it had been the previous afternoon. Whatever had been struck off had not been struck off the side facing us. I said it because it had to be said. I said, "Then the chips came from the inside." There was a silence after that. Picard said quietly, "Lucien, take a hammer. Tap the wall in 5 places. Listen." Lucien did this. He took a small mason's hammer, a tool that any quarryman could read sound from, and he struck the wall lightly in 5 different positions, working out from the center. The sound was not the sound of a wall set against solid rock. It was the sound of a wall set against air. There was a chamber on the other side, and the chamber was not small. Picard said, "How thick?" Lucien said, "From the resonance, perhaps 3 meters, maybe 4. Beyond that, I cannot say." Picard looked at the wall for a long time. He said, "We are going to open it." Caillot said, "Jean." Picard said, "Bertrand, there has been a man down here in the night. There are stone chips on this floor that came from inside a chamber that has been sealed since before our great-grandfathers' great-grandfathers were born. I do not believe in such things. I have never believed in such things. But I am not going to leave that wall standing today, because I am not going to spend tonight in my house up there with my wife and my daughters, not knowing what is on the other side of it. If we open it, we will know, and then we will decide." He said it the way a man says a thing when the other choice has become unbearable. We opened the wall that morning. I want to describe the opening properly, because I have been asked about it since, and because the small details turned out to matter. We did not blow it. Caillot refused to use powder on dressed mason work of that age, partly out of his own private respect for the Romans, who he said had built better than we did and deserved better treatment, and partly because he did not know what was on the other side and did not want to throw rock through it. We took the wall apart by hand, block by block, working from the upper left corner downward. Lucien Vossen and I worked the chisels. Picard and Caillot took the blocks as they came free and stacked them in the gallery behind us, in case the wall ever needed to be rebuilt. The mortar was as hard as we had feared. The first block took us nearly 2 hours. The second went faster, because by then we understood the rhythm of the joints. By 11 in the morning, we had cleared the upper 4 blocks, and had opened a hole through the wall about 1 meter wide and half a meter tall near the top of the dressed face. The first thing that came through the hole was the air. I want to tell you about the air carefully, because the air was the first sign that what we were dealing with was not a Roman storeroom or a forgotten cellar. The air that came through the breach was cold. Not cool the way a deep gallery is naturally cool. Cold the way a winter morning is cold. It came out in a slow, steady draw, as though the chamber on the other side were breathing out, and the cold of it raised the hair on the back of my forearm where my sleeve had been pushed up. It also had a smell. I have tried, for 68 years, to describe this smell, and I have never found the right words for it. It was not the smell of a tomb. I have been in tombs, the catacomb at Verdun, the family vault of the Corvisarts, the ossuary at Douaumont after the war. Tomb smell is dust and old bone and mineral cold, and it is not pleasant, but it is comprehensible. The smell that came out of the Roman chamber at Saint-Maurin was not like that. It was sweeter than tomb smell, and at the same time it was older. There was something in it of wet stone, and something in it of an animal that had been kept too long in a small space, and underneath those there was a third note that I am going to call simply attention. Although I know that is not a smell, because it is the only word that fits. The air smelled like something was paying attention to us. Lucien Vossen took 2 steps back from the hole. He crossed himself. He had not crossed himself once during the previous 2.5 weeks of working at the lower face. He was a Walloon and a Catholic, but he was not a demonstrative man about his faith, and the gesture, coming from him, told me more about what he was feeling than anything he could have said. Picard lifted his lamp to the hole and looked through. He stood there for perhaps half a minute, perfectly still, with his face close to the breach and the yellow lamplight on his cheek. Then he stepped back, and he handed the lamp to Caillot without a word. And Caillot looked. And then Caillot handed the lamp to me. I want to describe what I saw in the chamber exactly as I saw it, because this is the part of the story that the Jesuit at Verdun made me tell 3 times before he was willing to let me move past it. The chamber was bigger than the resonance had suggested. It was perhaps 8 meters across at the point I could see, and the ceiling rose into a dome shape that I could not see the top of, because my lamp would not throw light that far. The walls of the chamber were not Roman work. The walls were rough, irregular, cut but not dressed, and they curved inward and upward in a way that no Roman builder would have built. The floor was deep with a fine grey dust that had clearly not been disturbed for a very long time. In the centre of the chamber, raised perhaps half a meter above the floor on a low-stepped platform of the same rough stone, there was a depression. It was roughly circular, perhaps 2 meters across, and it was hollowed into the stone of the platform, and in shape it suggested a basin or a bed or a place where something might have lain. I could not see the bottom of the depression from where I stood. There was nothing inside the chamber that I could see. No bones, no artifacts, no tools, no inscriptions on the walls, beyond a few shallow lines near the depression that might have been writing, or might have been the natural fissures of the stone. The chamber was empty. It had the feeling of a chamber that had been empty for a very long time, but had once contained something, and had not entirely got over it. I lowered the lamp. I stepped back from the hole. I gave the lamp to Lucien, who declined to look. I noticed that my hands were shaking slightly, and I put them in my pockets. Picard said, "It is older than the wall." We all understood what he meant. The wall was Roman. The chamber on the other side of the wall was not. The Romans had not built that chamber. The Romans had found the chamber, and had built the wall to seal it shut, and had dressed the inside face of the wall, because they meant the dressed face to be seen by whatever was inside it. The wall had not been built to keep us out. It had been built to keep something in. Caillot sat down on a stack of removed wall blocks. He sat down heavily. He said, "Jean, we cover this back up, today, now, before any of the other men come down." Picard did not answer right away. He was looking at the hole. He said after a moment, "Bertrand, the chamber is empty?" Caillot said, "Jean, the chamber is empty now." It was at that moment that we heard the footsteps on the gallery slope behind us. It was Quarry. He had come up from Commercy on the morning train, unannounced, and had walked into the upper yard, and had asked the watchman where Picard was. And the watchman, who had not been told otherwise, had pointed him to the lower gallery. He came down the slope in his city boots and his good coat, with a young clerk behind him carrying a leather case. And he stopped about 10 paces from us, and he looked at the wall, and at the hole, and at the 4 of us, and his face changed. I will say this for Quarry. He was not a fool. He understood, within perhaps 30 seconds of arriving, that something significant had been opened, and that his foreman did not want it opened any further. He understood it, and he chose, having understood it, to overrule us. He said, "What have you found?" Picard said, "Monsieur Quarry, we need to speak privately." Quarry said, "Whatever you have found, I will see it now." He stepped past us. He went to the hole. He lifted his own pocket lantern, which he had brought down from the upper yard, and he looked through the breach into the chamber, and he stood there for a long time. When he turned back to us, his face had a colour in it I had not seen on it before. It was not fear. It was excitement. It was the excitement of a particular kind of man, the kind of man who looks at an empty Roman chamber sealed by a dressed wall, and sees, before he sees anything else, what it might be worth. He said, "Antiquities." Picard said, "Monsieur Quarry." Quarry said, "There are men in Paris who pay extraordinary sums for finds of this nature. The Roman wall alone, the markings on it, the chamber beyond. Picard, do you understand what you have opened here?" Picard said, "I understand that we should close it back up before the end of the day." Quarry laughed. He laughed in a way that was not unkind, but that was final. He said, "You will do no such thing. You will widen the breach. You will allow access. I will send a man down from Nancy tomorrow to examine the chamber properly. The contract for the stone will continue, and there will be a separate payment for the access, and you and your men will be paid handsomely for your part in the discovery. Do you understand me, Picard?" Picard said nothing. Quarry said, "Picard, do you understand me?" Picard said, "Yes, monsieur." Quarry was here a small man, and a vain man, and a man who had won an argument. He allowed himself to clap Picard once on the shoulder, in the manner of a benefactor. He said something cheerful about lunch. He turned and went back up the slope with his clerk, and when his footsteps had faded, we stood in the gallery in silence for a long while. Caillot said eventually, "Jean?" Picard said. I heard him. Caillot said, "We could close it anyway." Picard said, "And he would have us all dismissed by Friday and a Belgian crew down here by Monday, and the wall open whether we like it or not. You know that as well as I do." He sat down on the stack of blocks beside Caillot. He looked older than I had ever seen him. He said, after a moment, "We will widen it tomorrow. Slowly. We will keep 2 men at the breach at all times. We will not allow any single man to be alone in the gallery. And tonight we will sleep in the upper yard, all of us, with the gallery mouth in sight. If somebody came down here in the night before, somebody can come down here again. And I want to know who it is." We did all of that. We widened the breach the next day. We kept 2 men at it at all times. We slept in the upper yard, in the long stone shed where the carts were repaired, with blankets brought up from the village and a watch rotation that Picard wrote out himself. It did not help. On the morning of the 15th of May, when we went down at first light to take up the day's work, we found that one of our number was missing. It was the priest's nephew, Pascal Tardieu. The boy of 19, the dreamer, the one his uncle had sent up to be hardened by labor. He had been on the second watch the night before, between midnight and 3. He had relieved the man before him at midnight. He had not relieved the next man at 3. The next man had gone looking for him in the upper yard, had not found him, had assumed he had gone to relieve himself, had waited a quarter of an hour, and had then begun to call for him. There had been no answer. We searched the upper yard, the village lanes, the road down to Commercy. We found nothing. At about 8 in the morning, with the sun already climbing, Lucien Vossen went down the slope into the lower gallery to fetch fresh lamp oil from the magazine. He came back up at a run. He said, "Picard, Pascal's lamp is in the chamber." Picard said, "What?" Lucien said, "Pascal's lamp, the one with the chip on the brass collar. It is sitting on the platform inside the chamber, on the lip of the depression. It is still lit." Picard was already moving toward the slope. Caillot caught his arm. He said, "Jean, the boy left at midnight at the latest. It is now 8. That lamp has been burning for at least 8 hours." Picard said, "I know." Caillot said, "We filled those lamps yesterday at 4 in the afternoon. They hold 4 hours of oil, 5 at the absolute most." Picard stopped. He looked at Caillot. Caillot said, very quietly, "Jean, somebody has been refilling that lamp. We found Pascal Tardieu at 20 minutes past 9 on the morning of the 15th of May. He was inside the chamber. I want to describe the going in carefully, because I have been over it in my mind so many times that I no longer trust my memory of it without setting it down against the version I wrote in my notebook that afternoon, which I have kept all these years and which is in front of me now as I write. Picard went in first. He had to. He was the foreman, and a man was missing, and there was no one else who could be asked to go before him. We had widened the breach in the wall by then to perhaps 1.5 meters wide and 1 meter tall, big enough for a man to step through with care, and Picard stepped through it, carrying his lamp at chest height and a hammer in his other hand. He did not say what the hammer was for. None of us asked. Caillot went in second. I went in third. Lucien Vossen stayed at the breach with instructions to call for the men in the upper yard if anything happened, and to not, under any circumstances, follow us in. I had thought, looking through the breach the day before, that the chamber was empty. Standing inside it, I understood that I had been wrong. The chamber was not empty. It was still, which is a different thing. The fine grey dust on the floor had been undisturbed for so long that it had taken on the appearance of cloth, a soft grey carpet that lay over everything, and that softened the edges of the stone underneath it, and that gave the whole room a quality of having been prepared, the way a room is prepared for a sleeper before the sleeper arrives. The air was the same cold, breathing air I had felt at the breach the day before, and it moved very slightly, in slow, regular pulls, as though the chamber were drawing breath through some opening I could not see. The lamp on the platform was burning steadily. It was Pascal's lamp, the brass collar with the chip in it that had come from when he dropped it the first week he worked with us. The wick was trimmed neatly, the way Pascal trimmed his wicks, which was a finicky habit the older men had teased him about. The reservoir, when Caillot lifted it gently to check, was nearly full. It had been burning for at least 9 hours by then, on a reservoir that held 4. I will not pretend I was thinking clearly inside that chamber. I was 23 years old, and I was inside a room older than my country, and the air was wrong, and the lamp was wrong, and the dust on the floor had a pattern in it that I had not noticed from the breach, but that I noticed now. There were tracks. They came from a passage at the far end of the chamber, a passage I had not been able to see through the breach, a low arched opening in the rough stone of the wall that disappeared into a darkness our lamps would not illuminate. The tracks crossed the chamber from that passage to the platform in the centre, and then continued from the platform to the breach where we had come in, and then turned and went back to the platform, and then back to the passage, and then back again, and then again, until the floor of the chamber between the platform and the passage had been walked into a path. The path was not the path of a man pacing. The path of a man pacing is short, restless, inefficient. This path was patient. It was the path of something that had been carrying a thing back and forth between 2 places, slowly over many hours, with no particular hurry. The tracks themselves were the next thing I noticed. I did not understand them at first. I want to be honest about this. I looked at them for some seconds before my mind would accept what my eyes were telling it. There were 2 sets. One set was Pascal's boots, cheap nailed boots of the kind we all wore, with the small square nails in the heel that Pascal's mother had hammered in herself before he came up to Saint-Maurin, because she had not wanted him to slip on the gallery floors. I knew those boots. I had sat across from Pascal at supper for 3 weeks, and I knew every scuff and stitch on them. The bootprints went from the breach where we had entered to the platform in the middle of the chamber, in a clean walking line, taken at a normal pace. The other set was not bootprints. It was bare feet. The bare feet were not the bare feet of a man. They were the right shape. They were the right number of toes. But they were too long. Each print was perhaps a third again, as long as a man's foot would be, and the toes were extended in a way that suggested a hand more than a foot, and there was no arch. The print of the underside of the foot was flat against the dust along its full length, the way a child draws a foot before he knows what an arch is. The bare feet came out of the passage at the far end of the chamber. They walked alongside Pascal's boots from the platform to the breach. They walked with him. I want to make this point precisely, because it is the point that I have not been able to set aside in 68 years. Pascal's boot prints and the bare feet did not approach each other from opposite directions and meet. They emerged from the same starting point, the platform, and they walked side by side across the chamber to the breach, in the same direction, at the same pace. Whatever made the bare prints had been with him. It had been walking him to the breach. And then they turned around together, both of them, and walked back to the platform. And then to the breach again. And then to the platform again. The pattern repeated perhaps 15 times in the dust before the prints overlapped each other so completely that I could no longer count them. Pascal was on the platform. He was sitting upright on the edge of the stone basin, with his legs folded under him, and his hands resting on his knees, in the manner of a man who has been told to wait quietly. He was facing the breach, which is to say he was facing us. His eyes were open. He did not move when our lamps came on to him, and he did not move when Picard said his name. He was alive. I want to be clear about that. He was breathing. His chest was rising and falling at a slow, regular rate, and the color was in his face. And when Caillot lifted his wrist to feel for the pulse was there and was steady. He simply did not respond to us. He did not blink at the lamplight. He did not turn his head when Picard moved to his left or his right. His eyes were open, and they were not focused on anything in the room. Picard knelt down in front of him on the platform. He took Pascal's face gently between his two hands, the way a father does with a small child, and he turned the boy's head so that their eyes were level. He said, Pascal, it is Jean Picard. You are at Saint-Maurin. Look at me." Pascal did not look at him. Picard waited. After perhaps half a minute, Pascal's lips moved. He did not speak loudly. He spoke in a flat, conversational tone, in French, in a voice that sounded like his own voice, but that did not have any particular feeling in it. He said, "It is not finished." Picard said, "What is not finished, Pascal?" Pascal said, "It is not finished. There is more." He said, "There is more." He said I should sit and wait until you came. Picard said, "Who said this to you, Pascal?" Pascal did not answer. Caillot said very quietly, behind me, "Jean, get him out of here." We carried him out. He did not resist. He did not assist. He was a young man's weight, perhaps 60 kilos, and Picard took his shoulders and I took his ankles, and we lifted him through the breach the way you lift a person who has fainted, except that he was not fainted, and his eyes were still open, and they were still focused on nothing. When we had him through the breach and laid on a blanket in the gallery proper, Lucien Vossen looked at him and crossed himself a second time and said in Walloon and then in French, "He is not in there." That is the thing I have not been able to forget. That is the thing the Jesuit at Verdun made me repeat 3 times. Lucien Vossen, a stonemason of 40 years' practice, looking down at the open, empty face of the priest's nephew, said that there was no one inside it. We took him up to the surface. We laid him on a cot in the cart shed in the upper yard. The doctor was sent from Commercy. The priest at Saint-Maurin, Father Beaulieu, who had been the parish priest there for 31 years, and who had baptized most of the men working under us, came down within the hour, with his stole over his arm and a small leather case I had never seen him carry before. I want to say something about Father Beaulieu, because what he did that afternoon mattered. He was an old man. He was 68. He was a thin, grey, careful man in the manner of country priests of his generation, the kind of priest who had read his theology at the seminary at Verdun, and who took his sacraments seriously, and who did not have much patience for what he called les vieilles bêtises, the old foolishnesses, the village beliefs that survived underneath the Catholicism of the parish, like roots underneath a paving stone. He had preached against those beliefs for 30 years. He had told the older women not to leave bread out for the dead at All Souls. He had refused, in 1879, to bless a field that an old farmer believed had been cursed by his neighbour. Or he was a man of the new century. He looked at Pascal Tardieu, lying on the cot with his eyes open and his face empty, and he sat down on the bench beside him, and he opened his small leather case, and he took out a vial of holy water and a stole that I recognized as the stole used for the rite of exorcism, which is not a thing a country priest carries with him casually. He said to Picard, without looking up, "Show me where the wall was." Picard said, "Father, I do not know that you should go down there." Father Beaulieu said, "Show me where the wall was, Jean." Picard showed him. The priest stood at the breach for perhaps a quarter of an hour, looking through it without entering. He did not speak. He held his stole in his hand. At one point, he murmured something in Latin that I did not catch. Then he turned around and walked back up the slope to the upper yard, and he did not look back. And when he reached the cart shed where Pascal was lying, he sat down on the bench again, and he put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a long time. When he lifted his head, he said to Picard, in a voice that had gone old in the last hour, "Jean, the wall must go back. Today. Whatever is required." Picard said, "Father, Quarry will not allow it." Father Beaulieu said, "Then you will close it without his permission? You will close it tonight. You will pack the breach with stone and mortar, and you will not open it again. I will take the responsibility before the bishop and before God. Do not argue with me about this, Jean." Picard said, "Yes, Father." We sent word to Quarry at the inn at Commercy, where he was staying. The word came back within 2 hours. Quarry forbade the closing of the breach, was sending an antiquarian from Nancy by the morning train, and would have any man who interfered with the chamber dismissed and prosecuted for breach of contract. Picard read the note. He folded it carefully. He put it in his pocket. He called the men together in the upper yard. He stood on the cart shed step, and he told them what had been found in the chamber, and what condition Pascal Tardieu was in, and what Father Beaulieu had said, and what Quarry had answered. He did not soften any of it. He did not pretend. He said at the end, "I am going to seal the wall tonight. Father Beaulieu has asked me to. I believe I should do it, but I am asking each of you. Any man who does not want to be part of this work, or who does not want to remain at Saint-Maurin while it is happening, may take his pay and go, with no shame and no question. I am asking each of you now, and I want a clear answer. 5 men chose to leave. The 2 younger Vossen, Théophile, Lucien's brother, were the first. He said he had a wife and a child in Saucy, and he had no business in a place where men sat staring at nothing. He left that afternoon on foot, with his pay in his pocket, and his tools left behind for the brother who stayed. 3 of the local men went with him. The 5th man to leave was old Mathieu Reynard. He did not give a reason. He shook Picard's hand. He shook Caillot's. He nodded to me. He walked up the lane to the village, and I never saw him again. 14 of us remained, including Ferret. I want to mention here that Ferret had not been seen in the upper yard at any point during the morning. He had not been part of the search for Pascal. He had not been in the cart shed when we carried Pascal up. He had not been in the village when the doctor passed through on his way to the cot. He appeared in the upper yard at perhaps 4 in the afternoon, when Picard called the men together to ask who would stay, and he stood at the back of the group, with his hands at his sides, and his face very calm. And when Picard finished asking, Ferret said in the first words I had heard him speak in nearly a week, "I will stay." Picard nodded. Picard did not, I noticed, ask him where he had been all day. We began closing at 6 in the evening. Caillot mixed mortar in the upper yard. Lucien Vossen and I dressed the blocks we had removed 2 days before and stacked them at the gallery mouth. Picard took the men who had stayed and assigned them in pairs. 1 man to mix, 1 to carry, 1 to set, 1 to watch the gallery slope behind us, 1 to watch the upper yard above. By 8 in the evening, we had the lower 3 courses of the breach packed and mortared. The mortar was setting slowly in the cold air of the lower gallery. The chamber on the other side of the wall was silent. I had been afraid, when we began the work, that we would hear something from the other side, knocking, breathing, a voice. But we did not. The chamber was as it had always been. It was watching us close it back up, and it was not making any objection. That should have reassured me. It did not. Pascal had been moved up to the rectory at the priest's request, and Father Beaulieu was sitting with him there. 2 of the village women had been called in to help. I found out later that Pascal had not spoken again after the words he had said in the chamber. He had eaten a little soup when it was held to his mouth. He had slept, sitting upright with his eyes open. He had not blinked. At 10 o'clock at night, with the breach sealed to the upper edge of the original wall, and only the keystone course remaining to be set, I went up to the upper yard for fresh water. I was alone in the yard for perhaps 2 minutes. I looked up by accident toward the upper village. The lane that ran from the quarry yard up to the village was visible from where I stood, a pale line in the moonlight against the dark of the chestnut trees on either side. The village above was dark. Most of the houses had their shutters closed for the night. There was a lamp moving in the lane. It was moving down toward the quarry, not up toward the village. It was moving at the wrong pace. A man walking down a slope in the dark with a lamp moves carefully, with the lamp held low, his pace shortened by the grade. This lamp was moving at the steady walking pace of a man on flat ground. It was not slowing for the slope. It was not adjusting for the dark. It was coming toward the yard at the unhurried pace of something that did not need to see where it was going. I watched it come. It was perhaps 30 paces from the yard gate, when I realized that I could not see the person carrying it. The lamp was moving by itself at chest height in a straight line down the lane toward the quarry. I stood in the upper yard with the bucket of water in my hand, and I did not move, and I did not call out, and the lamp came down the lane and through the gate and across the yard, perhaps 10 paces from where I was standing, and it went past me without slowing, and it went down the slope of the gallery mouth, and it disappeared into the lower gallery. It did not make a sound. I went after it. I do not know why. I think now that some part of me believed that if I did not follow, I would never be able to look at the gallery again, and I would never be able to work stone again, and I would lose the only thing in my life that I knew how to do. So I followed it. I went down the slope into the lower gallery with my own lamp held in front of me. I had not gone 20 paces before I understood that I had made a serious mistake. The men were not in the gallery. They had been in the gallery 5 minutes before. Picard, Caillot, Lucien Vossen, 4 others, all of them working the keystone course of the breach. I had left them there when I went up for the water. They had not come up the slope past me. There was no other way out of the lower gallery. They had to be there. They were not there. The gallery was empty. The lamps were lit. The mortar trough was sitting where Caillot had set it. The keystone block was sitting on the lifting frame, ready to be raised into the last gap in the breach. The breach. The breach was open again. The 3 courses of stone we had set and mortared in the past 4 hours were gone. Not knocked down. Not broken. Gone. The mortar that had been wet at 6 in the evening and setting at 8 was gone with them. The breach was the breach we had made the day before, dressed clean, exactly as it had been when we first opened it, as though no one had ever touched it. And from inside the chamber, on the other side of the breach, I could hear a man's voice speaking quietly. It was Picard's voice. It was answering a question I had not heard asked. I have been writing for 3 days now. My hand is not as steady as it used to be, and I have been stopping often, and the pages have piled up on the table beside the window where I work. And my son's wife came in this morning to bring me my coffee and looked at the pages and asked me what I was writing. And I told her I was writing letters to old friends. She is a kind woman. She did not believe me. She did not press me. She set the coffee down and kissed my forehead and went out. And that is the kind of mercy a man learns to be grateful for at my age. I will finish today. There is not so much left to tell. I went down the gallery slope on the night of the 15th of May, on the heels of the lamp that had carried itself past me through the upper yard. And I came around the last bend in the slope and into the lower gallery proper. And the gallery was empty of men, and the breach in the wall was open, as if we had never sealed it. And from the chamber on the other side of the breach, I could hear Picard speaking. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I have been over it many times in my mind, and I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, and I have not allowed either to drift in 68 years. But I am also old enough to know that a man's testimony about a thing of this nature is not the same as a thing proved. And I would not blame any reader of these pages for setting the rest aside as the imagining of an old man who has been alone with his thoughts for too long. What I heard was Picard's voice. It was answering a question I had not heard asked. It was saying, in the slow, careful way Picard had of speaking when he was being honest, "I do not know. I have never known. My father did not know either. The wall was here when his father came to work the quarry, and his father did not open it, and his father's father did not open it, and I should not have opened it." There was a pause. Then Picard's voice said, "Yes, I understand." There was another pause. Then Picard's voice said, "Yes." I stood in the gallery, in front of the open breach, with my lamp held in front of me. And I did not go closer. And I did not call out. I cannot fully explain why. There was a quality in the air of the gallery, the same cold breathing quality I had felt the day before at the breach, but stronger, as though the chamber were no longer drawing breath in, but pushing breath out. And the quality of it told some part of my body that I should not move. And I listened to that part of my body, because I was 23, and I had been raised in country where men still listened to those parts of themselves when the priest was not watching. I do not know how long I stood there. It might have been 2 minutes. It might have been 10. Eventually I heard footsteps from inside the chamber. They were not Picard's footsteps. Picard walked heavily, with the slight drag of his right foot from an old injury at the Lerouville works. These footsteps were light, even, and unhurried. They came across the dust of the chamber toward the breach. I want to tell you that I ran. I did not run. I stepped backward, perhaps 3 paces, into the shadow of one of the limestone pillars that supported the gallery roof, and I lowered the wick of my lamp until it gave only the smallest light, and I stood there with my back against the stone, and I waited. The footsteps reached the breach. They stopped. Whatever was on the other side of the breach stood in the chamber and looked out through it into the gallery, and looked at my pillar, and saw me. I do not know how I know that it saw me, but I know that it did. It did not come through. It stood there in the breach, on the chamber side, and it looked, and after a long moment it spoke. It spoke in Picard's voice. It said, "Henri." I did not answer. It said, "Henri, come and help us with the keystone. We are nearly finished." The voice was Picard's voice. It had the warmth Picard's voice had when he was speaking to a young man he was fond of. It had the particular way Picard had of saying my name, with the slight lift on the second syllable that came from the older speech of his village. It was Picard's voice in every detail. It was not Picard. I knew it was not Picard, because Picard had been on the other side of the chamber, speaking perhaps 30 seconds before. I knew it was not Picard, because the footsteps that had crossed the chamber to the breach had not been his. I knew it was not Picard, because Picard, if he had wanted me, would have come out of the breach to fetch me, because that was the man he was. I stood in the shadow of the pillar with my back against the limestone, and I did not answer. The voice said, "Henri." It waited. It said in a tone that had changed slightly, that had become a little less warm and a little more patient. "Henri, I can wait." I do not know how long it waited. I lost track of time entirely. My lamp had burned almost out. The wick was guttering. I could see almost nothing in the gallery. I could hear, from the breach, a slow, regular breathing that was not Picard's, and that had stopped pretending to be. After what I think must have been at least an hour, the breathing moved away from the breach. I heard the footsteps cross the chamber again. I heard them move into the passage at the far end of the chamber, the one I had seen the bare-footed tracks coming out of, and I heard them grow fainter, and then I heard them stop. I did not move. I was still standing against the pillar when Caillot found me. It was nearly 4 in the morning. He came down the gallery slope with a lamp and a hammer in his hand, and he was bleeding from a cut above his ear, and his face, when the lamplight caught it, was the face of a man who had been running for a long time. He saw me. He stopped. He came over to me. He did not ask me what I was doing there. He put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Are you yourself?" I said, "Yes." He looked at my eyes for a long moment. He said, "Truly?" I said, "Truly." He nodded. He said, "Then come up. We are leaving." I went up the slope behind him. In the upper yard I found 7 men. Picard was one of them. He was sitting on the cart shed step with his head in his hands, and when he looked up at me and saw me come into the yard, he stood up and he came across to me, and he embraced me without saying anything, the way a man embraces a son he has thought was dead. Lucien Vossen was there. 2 of the local men were there. Ferret was not there. 3 others were not there. I asked Picard what had happened. He did not answer right away. He said after a moment, "We will speak about it on the road. Get your things. We are leaving Saint-Maurin in the next hour. I will tell you, briefly, what they told me later on the road down to Commercy, because that is the only account I have of what happened in the gallery while I was up in the upper yard fetching water. At about 10 o'clock, the breach had reopened. Caillot had been the first to see it. He had been mixing mortar at the gallery wall and had turned to find that the courses behind him were gone. He had called to Picard. The men had stopped working. They had stood in the gallery looking at the breach. Ferret had come through the breach. He had come through it from the chamber side. He had been inside the chamber the whole time. He had been inside the chamber, perhaps, since before any of us had come down that morning. Perhaps since before any of us had come down on any morning that May. He had stepped through the breach into the gallery, and he had stood there, and he had looked at each of the men in turn. And Lucien Vossen, who told me this part, said that Ferret's face had not been Ferret's face, and that the eyes had been wrong, and that the men had stood there for some seconds without being able to move. Then Ferret had spoken. He had spoken in a voice that was his own voice, and not his own voice. He had said 2 of the men's names, not Picard's, not Caillot's, not Lucien's. He had said 2 names, and the 2 men whose names, he said, had walked past the others, into the breach, and through it, and into the chamber, without speaking, without looking back, in the same flat, unfocused way Pascal Tardieu had sat on the stone basin, staring at nothing. The other men had stood frozen. Picard had been the first to move. He had taken the hammer from Caillot's hand, and he had struck Ferret across the face with the flat of it, and Ferret had fallen, and the spell that had been on the men in the gallery had broken, and they had run, all of them, up the slope into the upper yard, scattered. Picard had not run. Picard had gone into the chamber after the 2 men whose names had been called. That was the speaking I had heard. Picard in the chamber, trying to bring those 2 men back out. He had not brought them back out. He had come back out alone. He had said, on the road afterward, only that he had spoken with something that was not the men, and that the men were not coming back, and that there was nothing more that he could do for them, and that it had let him leave because it had wanted him to leave, and that we would not speak of what it had said to him. Not then, not later, not at any time. He kept that promise to himself. He never told me what was said to him in the chamber. He died in 1908 of pneumonia, with his wife and 3 of his daughters at his bedside, and so far as I know, he never told any of them either. The names Ferret had called were Pascal's name, which was how we eventually came to understand what had become of Pascal. Although Pascal himself, the body of him, was still lying in the rectory under Father Beaulieu's care. And the name of one of the local men whose family I will not write down here, because his children are still alive in this part of the country, and they have grandchildren now, and there is no reason for them to know. We left Saint-Maurin at first light. Picard, Caillot, Lucien Vossen, myself, and 3 of the others. We took the long road around through Saucy rather than going down through Commercy, because we did not want to be on the rail line where Guillory's antiquarian was due to arrive that morning. Picard sent word ahead to Father Beaulieu by a boy from the village. Father Beaulieu, when he received the word, went up to the quarry himself, with the village men who had not left, and they sealed the gallery mouth that day, with stone and mortar, and with whatever blessings Father Beaulieu had the authority to give it. He had no authority to perform a true exorcism. That authority belongs to the bishop. But he gave it what he could give it, and he wrote to the bishop at Verdun the same evening, and what passed between them I do not know. The official account, the one in the records of the prefecture at Bar-le-Duc, the one I signed in 1924, is that there was a rockfall in the lower gallery of the Saint-Maurin quarry on the night of the 15th of May, 1896, that 11 men were killed, including the proprietor's regional agent, Monsieur Théodore Guillory, and that the gallery was sealed for safety reasons and never reopened. Guillory's name is on the list because Guillory came up the next morning with his antiquarian and went down the slope to the gallery mouth and broke the seal Father Beaulieu had set. And what happened to Guillory in the gallery, I do not know, but he did not come back up. The antiquarian came back up. He left Saint-Maurin on the noon train, and he did not return, and so far as I have been able to discover, he never spoke about what he had seen, and he died in 1911 in a private asylum near Nancy. 11 men in the ground. 2 who never spoke again, Pascal Tardieu, who lived another 43 years in the Catholic asylum near Reims, and 1 of the men who had run with us up the slope and who began 3 weeks after the events to lose his speech the way a man loses light at evening, until by Christmas of 1896 he could no longer say his own name. 4 of us walked out and remained ourselves. Picard, Caillot, Lucien Vossen, myself. Picard died in 1908. Caillot died in 1919, in the war, although he was too old for the army, and what he was doing in Champagne in the autumn of 1918, I do not entirely know. Lucien Vossen returned to Belgium in 1897, and I lost touch with him. I am the last. I went to confession at Verdun in the autumn of 1903, because I had not been able to sleep properly for 7 years, and because a man came up to me one afternoon in the market at Commercy, whom I did not recognize, and he stood close to me, and he said my name in the manner of an old friend, and when I looked at his face, It was not a face I had ever seen before, and he smiled at me and said, "Henri, I have been waiting." I left the market without my purchases, and I walked the 70 kilometers to Verdun in 3 days, and I sat in the seminary chapel until one of the fathers came to ask me what I needed. The Jesuit who heard me was a thin grey man named Father Aubrac. I have written his name down once already in these pages, near the beginning. He listened to me for nearly 4 hours, in a small wood-panelled room off the chapel, and he asked very few questions, and when I had finished, he sat in silence for a long time, and at the end he asked me only this. He asked me whether the thing in the chamber, when it had stood in the breach and called my name in Picard's voice, had said anything else. I told him it had not. He asked again. He asked carefully. He said that sometimes a thing of that kind, when it had been found and refused, would say a particular phrase or a particular word, and that the word was important, and that he needed to know whether such a word had been said, because the answer would tell him what kind of thing he was dealing with. I told him no word had been said. This was a lie. I want to be honest about that now, at the end. I lied to a Jesuit in 1903, in the seminary at Verdun, in the room off the chapel, and I have carried that lie for 63 years. The thing in the breach had said one more thing to me, after it had said it could wait. I had not written it down in the account I gave Father Aubrac because I had not wanted it written down. I will write it down now, because there is no one left to be hurt by it, and because a man should set down what he carries before he goes. It had said, in Picard's voice, in the warm, patient tone Picard used with me when I had done something he was disappointed in, "Henri, I know your name. I have known it for some time. When you are old and you are lying in your bed, and the lamp has gone out, I will come and stand at your door, and I will say your name, and you will get up, and you will open the door for me. You do not believe this now. You will believe it then." That is what it said to me. I have not lit a lamp in my bedroom for 31 years. I sleep with the door bolted. My son thinks this is the foolishness of an old man, and I have allowed him to think so. The lamp on my writing table is burning low as I write this last page. It is 9:30 in the evening. The window beside me looks out onto the lane that runs up to the church. The lane is empty. The chestnut trees are still. There is no lamp moving on the lane, and there is no one walking down it. The seal at Saint-Maurin has held for 68 years. The village was struck off the rolls in 1934. The quarry mouth is overgrown now. I went there once, in 1947, with my son, who was a young man then and humouring his father, and we stood at the edge of the trees where the upper yard had been, and the gallery slope was filled with brambles and fallen stone, and there was nothing to see, and my son asked me what we were doing there, and I told him I had worked there as a boy, and he nodded, and we went home. That is everything I have to tell you. The bayou does not belong to the living. My father said that, and he was speaking of swamp water and shifting ground, but I have come to think he was speaking of something larger. There are places in this country, and in every country, where men have built walls in older times for reasons they did not write down. And the walls have held because the men who built them were wiser than we have been. And when we open those walls in our own time for our own reasons, we are not opening empty rooms. We are opening rooms that have been waiting. I will finish the coffee my son's wife brought me this morning. I will set these pages in the drawer of the writing table, where my son will find them after I am gone. I will go to bed. I will bolt the door. I will lie on my back in the dark and listen to the wind moving in the chestnut trees outside the window. I am 91 years old. I do not expect to see another spring. If the lamp goes out tonight, and if I hear a voice at the door that knows my name, I will know that the seal at Saint-Maurin has not held after all, and that I was wrong about the geography of waiting, and that what was patient in the chamber 68 years ago has finally come for the last witness who can name it. I will not open the door. I do not know whether that will be enough. It is what I have. Henri Lacombe, Commercy this evening.